War ends, cities fall silent, uniforms vanish, empires collapse into ash. But for some, the war never truly stops, because long after the guns cooled and the flags were torn down, there remained sons and daughters who carried something impossible to escape, their last names, children born into privilege, raised in grand houses, photographed beside the most feared men in Europe, and when the Third Reich died, they inherited not medals, but shame. Tonight we begin with a daughter who never stopped believing, Gudrun Himmler. She was born in the summer of 1929. To the world, her father would become one of the chief engineers of genocide. To her, he was simply Papa. While millions trembled at the name Heinrich Himmler, inside the family circle he was attentive, affectionate, almost gentle. He flew his little girl from Munich to Berlin so she could visit his offices. If she stayed home, the phone would ring every day. Letters arrived each week. He signed them with warmth. And he called her by a tender nickname, Poopy. She appeared at ceremonies, smiled for photographs. A child standing beside power, too young to understand what that power truly meant. Then came defeat, collapse, capture. The Reich disintegrated, and with it the protected world Gudrun had known. The official story said her father cheated the hangman, biting down on a hidden cyanide capsule after being taken by the British. But Gudrun rejected that version for the rest of her life. No, she said, he had been murdered. After the war, American troops arrested both her and her mother. From camp to camp they were moved across a broken Europe. Italy, France, Germany. Interrogations, questions, Nuremberg, and then in 1946, freedom. But freedom did not mean release, because outside the wire waited a new prison, memory. Many children of Nazi leaders tried to disappear, changed names, chose silence, built distance. Gudrun did the opposite. She dedicated her life to defending the man the world condemned. She became deeply involved in Stille Hilfe, an underground network that helped imprisoned and fugitive former SS members. To her, this was not politics, it was loyalty. A daughter guarding her father's honor. Years turned into decades, governments changed, generations passed, yet Gudrun Himmler never stepped away from the shadow. When she died in 2018, she remained what she had always been, the believer. But not every child chose devotion. Some would search for forgiveness, some for truth, and one would spend his life publicly destroying the myth of his own father. The next story begins with a boy named Bormann. If loyalty defined one path, the next would be shaped by distance. A distance from ideology, from family myth, from a father's terrifying reputation. But escaping a name carved into history is never simple. Martin Bormann Jr., born in April 1930, he entered a world already orbiting power. His father Martin Bormann stood at the very heart of Hitler's empire, a gatekeeper, a fixer, a man whose signature could change destinies. Inside that inner circle, access meant influence, and influence meant fear. But the son saw none of it, not the camps, not the machinery of death. He was kept behind the curtain, protected from the truth, while history tore itself apart outside. Then the war ended, and the curtain burned away. Files surfaced, testimonies echoed, numbers became graves. The boy learned what the world believed about his father. For many in his position, denial would have been easier. Instead, Martin Bormann Jr. turned towards something entirely different, atonement. He rejected the ideology that had lifted his family to prominence. He embraced faith, entered the Catholic Church, and pursued a life he hoped might heal rather than harm. Service replaced privilege. In time he worked far from Europe, in mission fields in Africa, in places like Congo and Cameroon, trying in his own way to build something good where so much evil had once flowed from his name. It was a radical break from his inheritance, or so it seemed, because history has a way of reopening wounds. In 2011, decades after his transformation, accusations emerged from the past. A former student claimed that as a child in the early 1960s he had been abused by Bormann. Others spoke of brutal physical violence. By then, age and illness had overtaken him. Dementia clouded his memory, leaving him unable or unwilling to respond. No criminal conviction followed, yet an independent Austrian inquiry into church abuses later granted compensation to the accuser. And so the narrative grew complicated. A man who had tried to escape a father's crimes found himself facing grave allegations of his own, redemption questioned, distance blurred, the shadow had returned. Some children defended their fathers, some tried to outrun them, but the next man we meet chose something far more explosive. He went to war against his own blood. There are many ways to live with a cursed inheritance: silence, denial, loyalty, but one son chose confrontation, not in whispers, not in private grief, but in public, relentless judgment. Niklas Frank, he was born in 1939, into comfort built on occupation. His father, Hans Frank, ruled over conquered Poland with ruthless authority, executions, terror, ghettos. To history he would become known as the Butcher of Poland, but to a small child he was simply father, a distant figure in uniform, a presence of power, a man whose crimes were still invisible behind palace walls. When the war ended, the illusion collapsed. Trials exposed documents, witnesses spoke, photographs surfaced, and Niklas Frank came face to face with what his family name truly meant. Where others searched for excuses, he searched for responsibility. As he grew older, he made a decision that stunned many Germans. He would not defend his father, he would indict him. Again and again in interviews, lectures and books, Niklas described his father as a criminal, a murderer, a symbol of moral catastrophe. He dissected the privilege he had enjoyed. He condemned the comfort that had insulated him. His writing was raw, furious, unflinching, not only toward Hans Frank, but toward himself. One of his most famous works, In the Shadow of the Reich, became both memoir and accusation, a son investigating how evil could sit at the dinner table and still be called normal. For Niklas, remembrance was not ceremonial, it was a duty. If the world forgot, he believed, the danger would return. His voice made him unusual among the children of high-ranking Nazis, painfully honest, often controversial, but impossible to ignore. In confronting his father, Niklas Frank forced an entire generation to confront theirs. Yet not every daughter or son was willing to tear down the memory of a parent. Some held on to affection, even when the world demanded condemnation, and no life captured that conflict more dramatically than the little girl once known as the Princess of the Reich. For some children of the Nazi elite, the fall of Germany meant poverty, interrogation, and shame. For her, it began in fairy tale luxury: silk dresses, grand halls, flash bulbs, a child presented to the nation as proof that power could also look gentle. Edda Göring, born just before the world plunged into war, she was the only daughter of Hermann Göring and the actress Emmy Sonnemann. Her arrival was celebrated across Germany, gifts flooded in, priceless art, treasures, symbols of devotion from those eager to please her father, one of the most powerful men in the regime. At the vast estate of Hall, she grew up surrounded by extravagance that few Europeans could even imagine while the continent burned. Photographers adored her. Here was innocence beside authority, a carefully crafted image of family life meant to soften the face of dictatorship. But images can lie, and childhoods built on stolen grandeur rarely survive history. As defeat approached, the world of Hall began to crumble. Mother and daughter retreated south toward the mountains near Berchtesgaden, hoping distance might offer safety. It didn't, because when the war ended, judgment followed. At the Nuremberg trials, her father was condemned to die. Before the sentence could be carried out, he took his own life. With that act, Hermann Göring escaped the rope. But his daughter could not escape the inheritance. The years that followed were quieter. Edda avoided publicity, rarely granting interviews, rarely inviting attention. Yet in private she clung to her love for her parents. To her they remained human, complicated, worthy of affection. The world saw a war criminal, she saw her father. Meanwhile the treasures of her childhood became battlegrounds. Courts argued over ownership of artworks and gifts presented during the height of Nazi power. Case after case slipped from her grasp. By the late 1960s, much of what had once surrounded her had vanished. The Princess of the Reich was left with memory and controversy. Then, in 1986, during a rare television appearance in Sweden, she broke years of near silence. There was no apology, no denunciation, only loyalty and love. When she died in 2018, she carried the same contradiction that had followed her all her life, a daughter's devotion in a world that demanded judgment. But if Edda held tight to family memory, the next man we meet would come face to face with horror itself. He would look into his father's eyes and hear no regret. Some sons inherit wealth, others inherit silence. He inherited a nightmare without knowing it. Rolf Mengele, born in March 1944, he entered the world while Europe was already drowning in catastrophe. His father Josef Mengele would become infamous as the Angel of Death, a man whose selections and experiments at Auschwitz turned medicine into terror. But Rolf did not grow up with that truth. Instead, he was raised on a story far more comforting. His father, he was told, had been a soldier, even a hero. The real history arrived later. Documents, witnesses, the unbearable details. For a teenager discovering who his father truly was, it was like learning the ground beneath him had always been hollow. Yet despite the name, Rolf tried to build an ordinary life. He studied law, worked as a corporate attorney, attempted normality, but history was not finished with him. After the war, Josef Mengele had vanished into South America, slipping through the global hunt for Nazi fugitives. Investigators believed the son might know something, and in a way he did. Letters had arrived, carefully written, bridging continents. Curiosity, confusion, and a need for answers finally pulled Rolf toward a decision that would haunt him forever. In 1977 he travelled to meet his father. Imagine the moment. A lifetime of rumour. A man transformed into legend, now sitting across the table, alive. What Rolf found was not repentance. There was no apology for the children of Auschwitz. No admission of guilt. Instead, Josef Mengele justified himself defending the indefensible with the calm certainty of a man who believed history had wronged him. For the son it was devastating. He despised what his father represented, yet betrayal proved impossible. Rolf returned to Europe, carrying a secret. He did not reveal the hiding place. And so the Angel of Death remained beyond the reach of justice. After that meeting, Rolf chose distance, a new identity, a quieter existence, a retreat from a name that would otherwise define every room he entered. Some believe he later became a family man, a retired lawyer, trying at last to live without ghosts. But the silence of 1977 would always follow him. The next child we meet faced a different choice. Not doubt, not conflict, but absolute loyalty to the end. While others wrestled with guilt or tried to escape their inheritance, he chose a straighter road. Defend the father, challenge the verdict, fight history itself. Wolf Rüdiger Hess. He was born into the upper ranks of the Nazi hierarchy, the son of Rudolf Hess, once one of Hitler's closest associates. In 1941, in one of the strangest episodes of the war, his father flew alone to Scotland, claiming he wanted to negotiate peace with Britain. Instead, he was arrested. And after Germany's defeat, he stood trial. At Nuremberg, Hess avoided execution. But mercy did not mean freedom. He was sentenced to life imprisonment and sent to Spandau prison in Berlin, where he would remain for decades isolated, aging, watched. For many families, such a sentence might have marked the beginning of distance. For Wolf, it became a mission. As a teenager, he visited his captive father regularly. Steel doors, echoing corridors, brief moments across a table. Each meeting strengthened his conviction that Rudolf Hess had been misunderstood, a patriot, not a criminal, and Wolf decided the world needed to be corrected. In the 1950s, he founded the Committee to Free Rudolf Hess. Supporters gathered, thousands of them, including figures from political life in Germany. Books followed, pamphlets, speeches. Year after year, Wolf repeated the same message. His father had done his duty. History had judged him unfairly. Time moved on. Governments changed. Yet Spandau remained, and inside it the old man grew frailer. In August 1987, Rudolf Hess died in prison. Authorities ruled it a suicide. Wolf refused to accept that conclusion. He claimed his father had been murdered, the victim of a conspiracy by those who feared his release. Even in death, the battle over memory continued. Wolf Rüdiger Hess spent his entire life in defense. He never abandoned the cause, never loosened his grip on belief. When he died in 2001, he left behind a record of unwavering devotion, a son standing guard over a father the world had condemned. But our final story is different again, because the last child would try, quietly and persistently, to step away from the spotlight, to build a future in which his surname did not dictate his identity. Not every legacy is defended, not every legacy is attacked. Some are simply avoided, handled like a live wire. Albert Speer Jr. He was born in the summer of 1934, in a Germany already tilting toward dictatorship. His father, Albert Speer, would rise to become Hitler's chief architect and later the minister responsible for armaments, a man whose efficiency helped keep the war machine running, fueled in part by forced labor. As a child, Albert Jr. moved in rare air. There is film of him playing near Hitler's mountain retreat in Berchtesgaden, the dictator watching from nearby as if this were all perfectly ordinary. But history rarely leaves such images untouched. When the Third Reich collapsed, judgment came swiftly. At the Nuremberg trials, his father received 20 years in prison. Unlike many others, Speer admitted a measure of responsibility, a confession that would later shape debates about guilt and remorse. For the family it meant exile from the world they had known. They retreated to relatives in Heidelberg, and the son began to change. Under the weight of disgrace and absence, Albert Jr. developed a severe stutter. Words became difficult, identity became heavier. Yet over time he fought his way back, trained first as a carpenter, then turned perhaps inevitably toward architecture. He insisted the decision was his own, not inheritance, not destiny, his. Throughout his life he worked across the globe, earning respect for urban planning and design, but interviews about his father were different, careful, measured, often avoided. In 2010 he admitted he had spent a lifetime trying to separate himself, to create a border between the man he was and the man whose name he carried. It was a quiet rebellion. Unlike some of the other children we've met, Albert Speer Jr. did not wage public war on his father's memory, nor did he defend it. He tried something else, distance, a life built forward, not backward. When he died at his home in Frankfurt at the age of 83, he left behind buildings, plans, projects, but the question that had followed him since childhood remained: can anyone truly escape a name written into history? The children of the Reich grew up, they loved, they denied, they fought, they mourned, some searched for redemption, others for vindication. All of them carried a past they never chose, and perhaps that is the final tragedy of inheritance.